I'm Evelyn Parker. Doshitsi. My daughter took me to dinner to celebrate selling my company. But the moment she left the table, a waiter rushed over and whispered, "Don't eat what's on your plate." That one sentence changed everything. What was supposed to be a celebration turned into a nightmare I never saw coming. I never imagined that selling Harbor Light Inns would leave me feeling more tired than triumphant. 40 years of my life poured into that business. Every weekend missed. Every birthday postponed. Every sleepless night catalogued in ledgers and board meetings. And now it was gone. Exchanged for a bank balance so large it looked fictional. $52 million. That was the number. But sitting in the corner booth of Seaview Grill, a coastal gem tucked into the quiet town of Newport, Maine, I felt more like a guest in someone else's celebration than the woman at the center of it all. Lauren sat across from me, her face calm but unreadable. She had always been the composed one, even as a child. The kind who colored inside the lines and didn't cry when she fell off her bike. At 39, she wore her cool like a shield. Her smile tonight felt mechanical, and I caught her checking her phone under the table more than once. Daniel, her husband, was practically bouncing in his seat. At 41, he carried himself like a man who had just won the lottery, though his tailored suit didn't quite hide the slight desperation behind his charm. He toasted twice before the appetizers arrived. To new beginnings, to family, to generational legacy. I sipped my sparkling water and smiled politely. I had requested no alcohol. The doctor had warned me last year. And for once, I listened. I tried to make conversation. Asked about their consulting firm, whether the Miami real estate market was recovering. Daniel launched into a long-winded monologue about opportunity zones and leveraged buyouts. Lauren barely interjected, mostly nodding while scrolling through something on her screen. Then he said it, out of nowhere. During the salad course, "You know, Evelyn, it might be a good time to start thinking about transferring some of your assets for tax efficiency. Maybe move a portion of the foundation under Lauren's name. Just for simplification. Nothing drastic. Just practical estate planning." I looked at him, fork halfway to my mouth. Lauren didn't even flinch. She was in on it. Her face was neutral, her hands clasped neatly in her lap. I chewed my bite slowly, thinking, they didn't waste time. Did they? Not even one dinner in, before hinting at control. It wasn't the first time Lauren had brought up the foundation. Ever since I announced I'd be starting it in your father's name. She had danced around the topic with increasing boldness. But this was the first time it came with a partner. Rehearsed and delivered like a pitch. I took a breath and smiled. "I appreciate your concern," I said, "but I'm still figuring things out. No rush." Lauren looked up, her voice mild. "We just want to make sure you're protected. These things can get messy without a plan." I nodded, my fingers tightening around the stem of my glass. "Of course. Thank you." She excused herself a few minutes later, said she needed to make a quick call. As she rose from the booth, Daniel turned his attention to a message on his phone. I watched Lauren step out of the restaurant, her silhouette framed by the soft glow of the sidewalk lamps outside. That's when I felt a presence at my side. A man in a dark vest. Early 50s. Salt and pepper hair. He leaned in without introducing himself. His voice was barely audible. "Don't eat what's on your plate. I'll explain later." Then he was gone, disappearing into the kitchen before I could say a word. My hands froze. I looked down at my entree. Sea bass. A lemon caper reduction. Nothing out of the ordinary. Then my eyes moved to the wine glass. I had ordered sparkling water, but Daniel insisted I try the alcohol-free Sauvignon Blanc. Said it was just for the ritual, and poured it himself from a bottle he'd brought with him. The glass sat untouched. I felt my stomach twist. The room felt colder. Daniel looked up, caught my eye, and smiled. "You all right, fine?" I said, folding my hands in my lap. I picked up the wine glass and set it aside, far enough that I wouldn't accidentally reach for it. Then I flagged down the original waiter and asked for hot tea. Something simple. Chamomile. He brought it quickly. No questions asked. I wrapped my fingers around the mug, letting the warmth settle my nerves. Outside, Lauren reappeared and slid back into the booth. Her face unreadable again. "Everything okay?" she asked. "Yes. Just switched to tea. My stomach's been funny all day." She nodded. And we ate the rest of the meal in practiced silence. By dessert, Daniel tried once more to steer the conversation back to trusts and beneficiaries. I nodded and smiled, and told them we'd talk again soon. When the check came, I insisted on paying. He tried to argue, but I was firm. "This one's on me," I said. "After all, it's my farewell dinner." I didn't explain what I meant. I don't think they noticed. As we left the restaurant and said our goodnights in the parking lot, I watched them walk to their black SUV. Daniel's hand casually on the small of Lauren's back. She didn't look back once. I stood there a moment longer, the ocean breeze brushing my face. Then I turned and walked around the building toward the kitchen entrance, hoping the man who warned me would still be inside. The hallway behind the kitchen smelled like garlic and steam and something metallic I couldn't name. I spotted the man from before standing near the back door, flipping through receipts on a clipboard. He looked up as I approached. "You weren't supposed to see me," he said. I stopped a few feet away, keeping my voice low. "But I did. And I'd like to know why you told me not to eat my food." He glanced over his shoulder, then gestured for me to follow him a little further down the corridor, toward a break room with an old vending machine humming against the wall. We stepped inside. He shut the door quietly. "My name's Anthony Reed. I manage the front of house here, but I used to work security back in Boston for Harbor Light. We never met. But I remember you." I blinked. That wasn't the answer I expected. "You worked for me," he nodded. "Briefly. Mostly late shifts. I left in 2016. Started over, out here. Look, I didn't mean to startle you, but I recognized your daughter and her husband the moment they walked in. They've been here once before. Not with you. With a man who smelled like trouble." "What kind of trouble?" He hesitated. "Fast talking. Flashy watch. Lots of cash. Made a scene over a comped meal. The husband called him G. Like they were close. Your daughter didn't say a word. Just sat there looking tired. But tonight, something felt off. When your son-in-law poured your drink from his own bottle." I paid attention. I felt the heat rise in my chest. "You think they tried to drug me? I don't know what's in that wine, ma'am. But I've seen a few things in my time. Enough to know when a smile's hiding something." I stared at the tile floor for a moment, then looked up. "Can you help me prove it?" He hesitated again, then nodded. "If that bottle's still on the table, I can grab it. We keep the bus bins for an hour before dishes go in." "Do it. Please. I'll cover any cost." Anthony left quickly. I waited in that stale little room with my heart pounding like I'd just sprinted across the street. 5 minutes passed. Then 10. I heard footsteps returning and opened the door just as he stepped back in. "Got it," he said, still half full. He handed me a clear bottle with a fancy label. I wrapped it in a napkin and slipped it into my purse like I was hiding a weapon. "Thank you, Anthony. I don't know what's happening yet, but something's very wrong." He gave me a solemn nod. "Just watch your back." That man's eyes were too calm, like he already knew the end of the story. I left through the side entrance and walked back to my car. Once inside, I locked the doors and sat there in the dark, clutching my purse to my chest. By the time I got home to Boston, it was nearly midnight. I didn't change clothes. I didn't wash my face. I just pulled out my phone and called Jessica. She picked up on the second ring. "Something's happened," I said. She didn't ask for details, just said, "Come by first thing in the morning. We'll figure it out." I placed the bottle on the kitchen counter, turned off the lights, and climbed into bed without even pulling back the covers. I didn't sleep. The morning light streamed in through the slats of my bedroom blinds, but it felt cold. I sat up slowly, as if my body didn't quite trust the day yet. I wrapped my robe around me and walked into the kitchen. The bottle was still there, sitting in the same spot on the counter, wrapped in a cloth napkin like it needed protection. I didn't touch it, just stared for a moment, then grabbed my keys and purse. Jessica's office was only 15 minutes away, but the drive felt endless. She greeted me with a warm hug and 2 mugs of coffee already poured. "Sit. Talk." I told her everything. The dinner. The strange behavior. The warning. Anthony. The bottle. Her eyes narrowed as she listened. She didn't interrupt once. When I was finished, she leaned back in her chair. "This is serious. If that bottle contains anything harmful, you need to test it immediately. I know someone who can help." "Who?" "Charles Miller, retired FBI. Now works in private investigations and legal consulting. He handles sensitive cases, quietly. You trust him." With my life, Jessica made the call. Less than an hour later, we were sitting in a private office in Cambridge. The blinds drawn, and a man with steel-gray eyes and a voice like gravel examining the bottle like it was a piece of evidence from a crime scene. Charles didn't waste time. He asked if I had touched or poured from it. I said no. He nodded, carefully slid it into a padded case, and told us he'd call within 24 hours. As we left, Jessica placed a hand on my arm. "I know this is hard, but you need to prepare yourself. If it is what we think, you'll have to make decisions quickly." "I know." Back at home, I sat on the couch, the quiet pressing in like a weight, and without warning, I found myself digging through the bottom drawer of my study desk. I pulled out the wooden box I hadn't opened in over a decade. Letters, all handwritten, all from Samuel. My husband died 14 years ago. A heart attack while traveling on business. I never got to say goodbye, but he used to write me little notes, especially when he traveled. One of them, folded neatly in its original envelope, sat near the top. I opened it with trembling fingers. "You're stronger than you think. But don't forget to rest. Don't forget to feel. And don't forget that Lauren needs more than money. She needs you." The ink had faded, but the words still burned. I had done everything I could to build a legacy, to provide, to secure our daughter's future. But I hadn't always been present. I hadn't always been kind. And maybe, in that silence, I left behind, something else had taken root. I sat there until the light changed, until my phone buzzed. A text from Jessica. "Charles just called. You need to come back." The second time I stepped into Charles's office, the air felt heavier, like it already knew something I didn't. Jessica was already there, arms crossed, eyes steady. Charles didn't make small talk. He motioned for me to sit, then slid a manila folder across the desk. Lab confirmed it. The wine contained propranolol. High dose. I stared at the word. My own medication. Used to manage my blood pressure and heart rate. In small doses, it helped me sleep. In high doses, it could stop a weakened heart. "That's what they used," Charles nodded. "Yes. Fast acting. Tasteless. Especially in something with citrus notes. You wouldn't have known until it was too late." Jessica leaned forward. "We have the full lab report. Timestamps. Chain of custody. It's enough to go to the authorities. But Evelyn, we need to talk about what you want next." I couldn't answer right away. My mind was swimming. With fear, with anger, with grief. Lauren, my daughter, the little girl who used to fall asleep on my chest while I worked through balance sheets, Who colored cards for me on every birthday? Jessica's voice softened. You don't have to decide today, but this can't sit still. Charles cleared his throat. There's something else. He pulled out a second folder. This one thicker. I did some digging. Daniel has outstanding debts. Real estate ventures. High-risk investments. He owes nearly $2 million. And recently, he's been in contact with someone flagged in our system. Former hedge fund partner turned grifter. Name's Gerald Foster. Goes by G. Anthony mentioned that name. Exactly. There's video surveillance from the restaurant's parking lot last month. Daniel and Gerald. Arguing. Envelope exchanged. Jessica looked at me. We can bring this to law enforcement. But it also means headlines. You'll be in the center of it. Harbor Light. The foundation. All of it. I took a breath. The kind that burns all the way through your lungs. No. Not yet. I want to know how deep this goes. And if Lauren's truly involved. Or just being used. Charles nodded. We'll keep it quiet. But time's short. That night, I sat at my piano. The one Samuel gave me for our 10th anniversary. I hadn't played in years. My fingers stumbled. The notes shaky. But it steadied something in me. There was still music here. Still fight. I called Jessica the next morning. Let's bring Anthony in. I want to see that footage myself. Charles met me and Jessica in the same office that afternoon. This time, Anthony was already there. Sitting in the corner with his arms crossed and his foot bouncing slightly. He looked nervous. Like someone who had seen too much and finally agreed to say it out loud. Jessica nodded toward him. Thanks for coming. Anthony. We appreciate it. He gave her a tight smile. Then turned to me. I brought the footage you asked for. You're going to want to see this. Charles dimmed the lights and loaded the video onto a small monitor. The timestamp read 2 weeks before our dinner. The exterior camera behind the restaurant showed Daniel pacing beside a dark gray sedan. A man in a camel coat stepped into frame. Gerald Foster. He didn't look threatening. Just slick. The kind of slick that makes your skin crawl. They argued. Daniel gestured wildly, pointing toward the restaurant. Then toward his phone. Gerald stayed calm. Said something I couldn't hear. Then handed Daniel an envelope. Anthony fast-forwarded. The two shook hands. Gerald walked away. Anthony paused the footage. This wasn't about dinner. This was a deal. And from what I heard that night from the kitchen, Gerald's name came up again. Your son-in-law isn't just in debt. He's in deep. And he's pulling Lauren along with him. I sat still. Heart pounding. Not because of what I saw, but because it confirmed what I had feared. Daniel was dangerous. And Lauren was either his accomplice or his hostage. Jessica leaned forward. We need to confront Lauren. Carefully. See where she stands. But Evelyn. You can't go in blind. Charles agreed. If you want, we can arrange a setup. Something casual. Somewhere safe. I'll be nearby. I looked at Anthony. Would you be willing to be there too? He nodded. Whatever you need. We decided on Sunday brunch. Lauren's favorite spot. A sunny bistro in Beacon Hill. I called her the next morning. Told her I missed her. That we hadn't had time to talk one-on-one. She sounded surprised. Maybe suspicious. But agreed. The day came. I arrived early. Sat by the window. Hands wrapped around a coffee cup. I barely sipped. Charles and Anthony sat in a parked car across the street. Jessica was on standby. Lauren walked in 5 minutes late, wearing that effortless chic look she always favored. She kissed my cheek, sat down, and smiled like everything was fine. You look good. Mom. Thanks. So do you. We ordered. Chit-chatted. I asked about work. She gave vague answers. Then I dropped it. I saw Daniel the other night. With Gerald Foster. She froze. Blinked. But didn't respond. Do you know him? She picked up her water glass. Daniel's made some bad choices, but I'm handling it. Handling what she looked me dead in the eye. The debt. The threats. The people he owes don't take no for an answer. So you went along with it. She didn't deny it. Just looked down at her plate. I didn't know how bad it was. At first. Then it got too far. He promised it was temporary. That no one would get hurt. I nearly whispered. But I could have died. She shut her eyes. Her voice cracked. I didn't know he would do that. I swear. I never agreed to that. I reached across the table. Grabbed her hand. You need to tell me everything. No more lies. She nodded. Barely. We have a lot to talk about. Outside. Charles texted me one word. Clear. We sat in silence for a while after that. The bistro buzzed around us, full of Sunday chatter and clinking silverware. But at our table, the air was frozen. Lauren stared at her plate, as if she could will the world to rewind. I kept my hand on hers. Firm but not forcing. She didn't pull away. I need you to tell me everything. I said again. Not just about Daniel. About you. She finally looked at me. Eyes rimmed with guilt and something else I hadn't seen in years. Fear. It started before the wedding. She said quietly. Daniel always had these big ideas. Risky. But exciting. I thought I could rein him in. But the truth is, I liked it at first. The thrill. The ambition. It felt like finally doing something bold. Her voice cracked. But after the market crashed in 2018, he never recovered. He started borrowing. Quietly. Then recklessly. He forged my signature on a second mortgage. I didn't find out until we were months behind. By then, we were bleeding from 10 directions. I kept my face calm. But inside, I was reeling. Why didn't you tell me? Because I was ashamed. You always made it look so easy. Mom. Business. Marriage. Raising me. I didn't want to admit I'd failed. You didn't fail. He did. She flinched like I'd slapped her. But I stayed. That's on me. I let the silence stretch. Then pressed gently. So, what was the plan? At that dinner, was it his idea? Her eyes flicked to mine. Then away. He said we needed leverage. That if we could prove you were unwell, unstable, he could make a claim to the foundation. Said he had a contact in estate litigation. That if you collapsed in public, it would all line up. A medical episode. You'd step back. Sign over control. I could hardly breathe. And the wine, he said it was just enough to lower your blood pressure. Make you faint. Not enough to kill you. I scoffed. Do you really believe that? Do you even know what dose he used? She shook her head slowly. Her shoulders slumped. No. And I didn't stop him. That's the truth. I leaned back in my chair. Exhausted in a way that didn't feel physical. The betrayal was one thing. But the loss of trust, the decay of something I thought was still redeemable, that was unbearable. We're going to the police, I said. She went pale. Not yet. Please. Let me help. Let me do something right. Like what her jaw set. He has files. On a burner drive. He keeps it hidden. But I know where it is. Bank statements. Contracts. Deals he didn't want tied to our names. He used them to blackmail people. If I can get it. You can bring everything to court. Not just the wine. All of it. I hesitated. It was risky. If Daniel found out, she could be in danger. He's leaving tomorrow for Chicago. She added. For 2 days. I can do it while he's gone. I exhaled slowly. You have one chance. Lauren. One. If I even sense you're playing both sides, I'm not. She whispered. I stood up. She followed. We didn't hug. We just looked at each other. There were 1,000 things I wanted to say. But none that would land right. Keep your phone on. I told her. I will. I walked out and didn't look back. That night, I called Jessica and told her everything. She didn't trust it. Not entirely. But agreed we had to follow the thread. Charles set up surveillance around Lauren's house. Anthony offered to monitor Daniel's travel from the airport. On Tuesday, I sat in Charles's office again. Jessica was beside me. We watched a live feed from a camera hidden in Lauren's den. She moved methodically, lifting a floorboard beneath a dusty armchair. From the cavity, she pulled out a slim, black hard drive. We held our breath. She plugged it into her laptop, opened folder after folder. Contracts, emails, names. Some I recognized. Others sent a chill down my spine. Offshore accounts, payoffs, silent partners. Charles leaned in. This is gold. Then Lauren froze. Her eyes darted to the side. Her mouth moved, though we couldn't hear. She shut the laptop, yanked the drive, and stood. What's happening? I asked. A new voice came from the hallway cam. Low. Male. Daniel. He wasn't supposed to be back until morning, but there he was. Early. Silent. Watching her from the doorway. My stomach dropped. Jessica grabbed her phone. Charles hit a button, switching to the front door feed. He's locking it. Lauren backed up, the hard drive still in her hand. Daniel stepped forward. Slowly, his mouth moving calmly, like this was just another disagreement. Then he grabbed her wrist. Jessica shouted into her phone. Cops are en route. Charles tapped a key. We're live streaming this to secure cloud storage. If he destroys the drive, it's backed up. We watched helplessly as Lauren twisted free, bolted down the hall, locked herself in the bathroom. Daniel pounded on the door. Sirens wailed in the background. A minute later, 2 officers burst through the front door. Daniel raised his hands, but didn't look surprised, just resigned. Lauren emerged seconds later, clutching the drive like a lifeline. Jessica turned to me, voice calm but firm. It's over. At least this part. I felt nothing at first. No triumph. No release. Just the strange stillness that comes after a storm. I texted Lauren that night. I'm proud of you. But we have a long road ahead. She replied only one word. I know. The next morning, Boston felt heavier than usual. It wasn't the gray sky or the sharp wind coming off the harbor. It was the weight of everything that had cracked open the night before. Jessica came by early, with 2 cups of coffee and a copy of the preliminary police report. Lauren had given her full statement. So had Daniel. Gerald Foster was still at large. But the authorities now had a warrant out and a long list of digital evidence tied directly to him. You're lucky, Jessica said, though her voice lacked its usual energy. If Lauren hadn't moved when she did, this would be a different conversation. I nodded, though I couldn't find words. We sat on the couch in silence until the clock ticked past 10. Jessica finally broke it. You need to think about what you want to do publicly. The foundation, the board, the press. It's only a matter of time before someone leaks what happened. I know. Are you prepared to step forward, file charges, face Daniel in court? I thought about it. About what it would mean. Not just for me, but for Lauren. For Samuel's legacy. For every employee and donor tied to Harbor Light or the new foundation. I want to do it right. I said. Quiet. But firm. No media, circus. No vengeance for show. Just truth. Jessica smiled. That's why I'm here. By early afternoon, Charles joined us. He had copies of Lauren's recovered files, sorted and time-stamped, along with a short list of names he recommended contacting before the press caught wind. The first was an old friend of mine, Margaret Klein, who had served with me on the Harbor Light board. She had connections across the legal and philanthropic world. The second was a former prosecutor turned nonprofit watchdog, Erin Brody, known for her integrity and brutal efficiency. We met them both in a quiet conference room, 2 blocks from the courthouse. I laid out everything. The poisoning attempt. The debt. The blackmail. The manipulation. Margaret didn't flinch. Aaron took notes without once looking up. At the end, Aaron looked at me. If you want this cleaned up, I can help. But it means freezing all assets connected to Daniel. Possibly Lauren's accounts too. She has cooperated fully, I said, and risked everything to bring that drive forward. Aaron nodded. I'll do what I can. But the courts may not separate them completely. I understand. Margaret spoke next. And the foundation. You'll need to name a new executive trustee. I already have. She raised her eyebrows. Jessica smiled. It's Evelyn. Again. I don't want to hold it forever, I said. But until this is resolved, I'm taking it back. By the end of the week, legal notices were filed. Daniel remained in custody, pending formal charges. Lauren moved into a small apartment in Cambridge, just 2 blocks from her old grad school library. She asked for space, and I gave it. I visited Anthony at the restaurant. He had taken a few days off after the police stormed his kitchen for surveillance follow-up. We sat in the alley behind Seaview Grill, each holding a cup of coffee. And steam curling into the crisp air. You okay? He asked. Getting there. You know, it doesn't always play out like this. Most people look the other way. I didn't know how to answer that. I just gave him a quiet thank you. And he patted my shoulder. A week later, Charles handed me a manila envelope. Inside were stills from the footage Lauren had recovered. One of them showed Daniel slipping the wine bottle into his jacket before the dinner. Another captured Gerald in a hotel lobby days before. This will hold up, Charles said. You've got more than enough to pursue full charges. And I will, I said. But not until Lauren signs the immunity agreement. Jessica made it happen. Within 2 days, the DA's office agreed not to prosecute Lauren in exchange for full testimony and cooperation. She signed it in a quiet office, hands trembling, but eyes clear. We walked outside afterward. She leaned against the railing overlooking the Charles River. I don't expect forgiveness, she said. I'm not there yet. I know. But I also don't want to lose you entirely. You haven't. Not yet. She nodded, then wiped her face with the back of her hand. I watched her walk to her car and disappear into the late afternoon traffic. That night, I sat at my desk with a legal pad and a red pen. I drew 2 columns. What I lost. What I still had. I lost peace. Trust. Simplicity. But I still had control. Truth. A future I could still shape. I drew a line through the middle. And I began again. It had been 2 weeks since Lauren signed the immunity agreement. The media had caught on by now. Mostly thanks to a leaked photograph of Daniel being escorted out of their Beacon Hill home in cuffs. The story was spinning fast. Former son-in-law of Boston philanthropist under investigation for fraud and attempted poisoning. I hated how sensational it sounded. But there was no controlling it anymore. I declined every interview. Released only a brief statement through Jessica's office, confirming that I was cooperating with authorities and prioritizing the stability of the Samuel Parker Foundation. That quieted things for a few days. But not everyone stayed quiet. Margaret called late Tuesday afternoon. Evelyn, you need to see this. She forwarded me a link to a podcast hosted by a man I'd never heard of. Someone who made a name stirring online outrage and true crime drama. There, in his smug voice, he described me as cold, calculating, implied that I had orchestrated everything to regain control of the foundation. I wanted to throw my phone. Instead, I turned it off and went for a walk. The wind off the harbor was sharp, but it helped. I passed old storefronts. Children in wool hats, dragging parents down icy sidewalks. A food truck steaming in the cold. Normalcy. God. I missed it. When I got home, there was a message from Anthony. He had heard the podcast too. Don't let them twist it, he said. If you ever want to get your story out, I know someone. Local. Real journalism. I can vouch. I wasn't ready for that. Not yet. Instead, I called Lauren. She didn't answer. But she texted back within the hour. Can we meet soon? I have something for you. We chose neutral ground this time. A small art gallery near South End. Quiet on weekday mornings. When I arrived, Lauren was already there. Standing in front of a black and white photograph of a woman with her face turned to shadow. You look tired, I said. She gave a weak smile. So do you. We walked through the gallery slowly, stopping at nothing in particular. After a few minutes, she pulled an envelope from her bag. Bank accounts. Wire transfers. A timeline Daniel kept hidden from even me. Jessica might want it. I took it. Part heavy. How are you holding up? She hesitated. Some days, I don't know who I am. I wake up in that tiny apartment and wonder if I ever really lived in our old house, or if I imagined the whole thing. You didn't imagine it. You just didn't see the rot right away. Her eyes filled, but she blinked fast. I want to work. I want to be useful again. Not just survive this, but contribute. I thought about it. She had made mistakes. Terrible ones. But she had also risked herself to put things right. Slowly. Carefully. I reached for her hand. Come by the foundation tomorrow. There's more than enough to do. She looked stunned. Then grateful. Thank you. Don't thank me yet. The board still has to approve, and you'll start from the bottom. No special treatment. Wouldn't expect it. We parted quietly. No big hug. No forgiveness speech. Just a small nod of something resembling hope. The next day, Lauren showed up 10 minutes early. She wore a gray cardigan and slacks. Hair tied back like she had in college. Jessica greeted her first. Then Charles handed her a stack of folders and a rundown of the donor database. She got to work without complaint. I watched from the hallway. Not hovering, just observing. The staff eyed her with polite curiosity. No one whispered. At least not loudly. That was a start. In the afternoon, I met with the board. Margaret spoke first. I've reviewed everything. She's not blameless. But she came forward at risk to herself. I support giving her a chance. One by one. The others nodded. It wasn't unanimous. But it was enough. After the meeting, I stepped outside into the late November air. The wind had softened. Across the street, I saw a woman walk her dog past a bookstore. A couple laughed over coffee. The world was still turning. Inside my coat pocket, my phone buzzed. It was Jessica. You might want to come back upstairs. We just got a call from a federal investigator. Gerald Foster is in custody. My breath caught. Where LaGuardia Airport? Trying to board a flight to Buenos Aires. What do they have on him? Enough to tie him to 2 other fraud rings. And now, thanks to Lauren's files, conspiracy to commit medical harm. We're on solid ground now. I turned toward the building. Heart pounding but steady. For the first time in weeks, I felt like the end was in sight. 3 days after Gerald Foster was taken into custody, I received a call from the assistant U.S. attorney handling the case. His tone was professional, clipped. But there was a subtle edge to his words that made my grip on the phone tighten. We believe Mr. Foster may be willing to negotiate. He's asking to speak with you. Why me? He says he has information you'll want to hear. And he's only willing to share it with you directly. I sat at my kitchen counter, staring at the steam rising from my mug. I didn't like it. I didn't want to sit across from the man who tried to orchestrate my poisoning. But something about the way the prosecutor phrased it, information I'd want to hear, made my stomach churn. Jessica was already in my driveway by the time I called her. We drove together to the Federal Holding Center in South Boston. Neither of us saying much. The air between us was heavy with possibility and doubt. Inside, everything smelled sterile, cold, as if no one had ever really belonged there. We were led into a small room with a glass partition. A guard stood in the corner. Gerald Foster looked thinner than I remembered, less polished. His designer coat had been traded for a standard jumpsuit, and he no longer had the slick confidence he wore like cologne. He picked up the phone on his side of the glass. I hesitated, then did the same. "Evelyn," he began. Voice low. "Practiced. I assume you don't want pleasantries." "You assume right." "Good. Then let's skip ahead. I have documents. Proof Daniel wasn't acting alone. There's someone else. Someone inside your foundation. Someone who knew your schedule, your security habits, your personal preferences. That's how they timed the wine." My blood froze. "Who?" "Not yet. I give you names. I want something in return. You're not in a position to bargain. Maybe not legally. But public pressure is real. And if I start talking to the press, I can shape the story before the courts ever do." He wasn't bluffing, and we both knew it. "What do you want?" "Reduced sentence. Transfer to a minimum security facility. And immunity for my sister, who had no knowledge of my dealings. She just loaned me her apartment. I'll consider it, but I want those names now." He leaned in slightly. "Abigail Cho." I stared. Abigail had been my assistant for almost 6 years. Smart, efficient, quiet. The kind of person you trusted without realizing it. The person who reminded you about birthdays and picked up your dry cleaning when she was already swamped. That's not possible. Check her personal accounts. You'll find deposits that don't match her salary. Her brother owns a shell company in Delaware. That's where the money funneled through. He hung up without waiting for a response. Back in the car, Jessica looked at me. "You okay?" "No, but I will be." "Check her." We did. Charles and a forensic accountant reviewed every financial trail connected to Abigail. It took 2 days. On the third morning, Charles walked into my office and shut the door behind him. "It's true. Not just the deposits. She also rerouted emails, deleted certain calendar entries, and redirected 2 calls from the security firm straight to Daniel's number last month." I stood slowly, feeling like the floor had tilted beneath me. "Is she still here?" "She called in sick today. First time in years. Call the police. Quietly. And freeze her access." Within the hour, Abigail was taken in. She confessed faster than anyone expected. She said it started small. A favor for Daniel when he offered to help pay off her student loans. Then it grew. Files. Schedules. Poison was the first line she wouldn't cross. But by then, it was too late to walk away. I sat in my office long after everyone else left. I thought of all the people who had smiled at me while helping take me apart piece by piece. Lauren knocked gently and stepped inside. "I heard about Abigail. So did everyone else by now. I'm sorry." "Mom." I nodded. She stood there a moment longer, then quietly placed a folder on my desk. "The holiday gala schedule. I thought you'd want to review it." I looked up at her. Really looked. She was tired, but steadier. Stronger. The woman she used to be before Daniel. Maybe someone even better. "Thank you." She paused at the door. "We're still standing. You know, barely. Still counts." After she left, I turned to the window. The skyline shimmered against the darkening sky. I sipped cold coffee and exhaled. I wasn't done yet. The courtroom was colder than I expected. Not in temperature, but in tone. Everything felt sharp, metallic. The pale light, the echo of shoes on polished tile, the shuffling of papers and muffled coughs. It was the kind of room where truth became performance and justice played by rules too often bent. Jessica sat beside me at the plaintiff's table, a stack of folders at her elbow and a calm that I envied. Charles was behind us, arms crossed, watching every face that entered. Daniel was brought in last, cuffed, dressed in a suit that didn't quite fit anymore, like his past life was still clinging to him. He didn't look at me, not once. The judge entered. The bailiff called order. The proceedings began. It wasn't a full trial. Not yet. This was the pre-trial hearing, where motions were filed and the case was set for the road ahead. But even at this early stage, the weight of it pressed on my chest like a hand refusing to lift. Jessica presented the surveillance footage first. The wine bottle, the switch, the silent nod from Daniel to Abigail. Then the testimony from Anthony. Then Lauren's signed affidavit, detailing the plot and her role in unearthing it. Daniel's lawyer objected more times than I could count. But the judge, a seasoned woman named Judge Holloway, let most of it stand. By the lunch recess, the defense looked rattled. In the hallway, Lauren approached me, a file in hand. She wore a navy blazer and no makeup, her hair tied back again. I could see the effort it took her to be there. This just came in from the forensic team. It links one of Abigail's deleted email accounts to Gerald Foster's firm. Directly. Jessica skimmed the top page and whistled low under her breath. That's enough to shut down the last hole in the timeline. Lauren looked at me. You don't have to say it, but I want you to know. I'm here. All the way. I nodded. Eyes tight. I know. Back inside. The judge returned and scheduled the formal trial date for February. That gave us 8 weeks to finalize discovery and prepare. As we exited the courthouse, reporters shouted, questions. I kept my head down. Jessica guided me through the side exit to the car. The ride home was quiet, until I asked the question I hadn't dared say aloud. Do you think he'll take a deal? Jessica exhaled. If he's smart. Yes. With what we've presented, the prosecution won't go easy. But Daniel's pride is dangerous. He might drag it out just to hurt you. Let him try. That night, I sat in my study with the fireplace glowing low. I reread the draft from my foundation's year-end letter. It was filled with safe language, gratitude, progress, but no truth. I picked up a pen and began rewriting. In this season of reflection, I've learned that integrity costs more than I imagined. I've seen the sharp edges of betrayal, and I've felt the quiet strength of those who choose to rebuild rather than destroy. Our mission remains, not because it's easy, but because it is necessary. By morning, I had rewritten every paragraph. The following week, Lauren and I met with the board to announce changes in oversight policy. We implemented a 2-signature rule for all major transactions, quarterly financial audits by an external firm, and a transparent ethics review process for all senior staff. It wasn't just for show. It was what I should have done from the start. At the end of the meeting, Margaret pulled me aside. You're not the same woman who started this foundation. I smiled. Tired but real. No. But maybe that's not a bad thing. Lauren worked late most nights now, quietly organizing years of donor records and cleaning up the shadow left behind by Abigail's digital footprint. She didn't complain. She didn't seek praise. She just kept going. One evening, she knocked on my office door. I have something. I've been putting it off. But it's time. She handed me a sealed envelope. Inside was a personal letter she had written to the foundation staff. A full confession. Her role. Her regrets. Her commitment moving forward. Are you sure? Yes. I want them to hear it from me. Not a memo from PR. I looked at her and felt something deep begin to settle. Not forgiveness. Not yet. But trust. A new version of it. Earned. Not inherited. We'll send it out first thing Monday, I said. As she left, I looked around the office. Framed photos. Newspaper clippings. Samuel's old watch sitting on the bookshelf. For the first time in months, the weight in my chest loosened. We had more hearings ahead, more headlines, possibly even a full trial if Daniel refused to fold. But I wasn't scared of him anymore. The snow fell in sheets that morning. Thick, wet flakes that blanketed the sidewalks and muffled the city like a held breath. I arrived at the courthouse early. Boots soaked, coat dusted white. Jessica was already inside, conferring quietly with the assistant district attorney. The final pre-trial conference was scheduled to begin within the hour. Daniel had still not accepted a plea. Today would determine whether the full trial would move forward or if a deal would be struck in the 11th hour. Everyone in that building knew it. The energy felt like a wire stretched too tight. Lauren joined us shortly before the doors opened. Her face pale but composed. She wore the same navy blazer from before. Her eyes sharp. She didn't speak until we sat. I dreamt last night that he just disappeared, vanished into the air like smoke. I didn't tell her that I used to have the same dream, back when the pain was fresh. And all I wanted was for this to be someone else's life. Jessica leaned in. The ADA says if he doesn't flip today, they're ready to go to trial. Jury selection could start as soon as next month. But she trailed off as Daniel walked in. This time, he looked directly at me. There was no smugness, no arrogance, just a strange hollowness, like he'd finally seen the walls closing in. His attorney whispered something in his ear. He didn't nod, just blinked. Then, as the judge took her seat and called the court to order, his lawyer stood. Your Honor, my client would like to address the court. The room stilled. Daniel rose. His voice was low, clear. I would like to enter a plea of guilty, on all charges. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Judge Holloway confirmed the statement and asked the standard questions. Was he coerced? Did he understand the consequences? Did he wish to waive his right to trial? He said yes to all, without hesitation. When it was over, and the room slowly emptied, I sat still. My fingers trembled, not from fear or triumph, but from the sheer release of it. He pleaded guilty. Lauren whispered. I didn't think he'd do it. I did. At the very end, he always chooses himself. And this was the only move left that made him look like he still had some control. Jessica gathered her files. Sentencing is next month. We'll push for full restitution and the maximum penalty. It won't undo everything. No. But it will close the door. Outside, the snow had slowed. The sidewalks were salted, slushy, but passable. We walked together in silence until Lauren turned to me. What now? I thought of everything that had happened. The lies, the betrayals, the slow unraveling of trust, but also the rebuilding. The truth that came, not all at once, but in pieces, sharp and slow. Now, I said, we keep going. We show up. We work. We remind people why this foundation mattered in the first place. Later that week, we held the rescheduled winter gala. It wasn't as large as years past, but every seat was filled. Margaret gave opening remarks. I spoke second. I didn't tell the whole story, just the part that mattered. This year has tested us in ways I never imagined. But adversity didn't define us. Our response did. And I am proud to say, tonight, this mission stands stronger than ever. The audience rose. Not in ovation, but in solidarity. I saw tears in the eyes of people I had known for decades. And at the very back, near the entrance, Anthony stood in a waiter's uniform, nodding once before, slipping out again. As the music swelled, Lauren took my arm. For the first time in a long time, we danced. A month later, the sentencing hearing took place on a gray Tuesday morning. The sky looked like steel, flat and unmoving. We arrived early, slipping into the back of the courtroom while the clerks prepared. I didn't dress for drama, just a navy wool coat, dark slacks, and the pendant Samuel gave me the year we opened our first inn. Daniel stood when called. His lawyer asked for leniency, citing stress, financial pressure, and poor judgment. The prosecution countered with a clear timeline, a list of victims, and the irreversible damage to my health, my trust, and the foundation. When the judge invited me to speak, I rose slowly, hands steady. I didn't read from a paper. Your Honor, I am not here to beg for justice. I am here because I survived, because others might not have, and because silence in the face of betrayal is just another form of surrender. I spoke about intent, about how someone you love can become someone you fear. One excuse at a time. I spoke about Lauren, without using her name, and how change is only real when it begins with truth. When I sat down, there were tears in the room, but not in me. I had shed enough. Judge Holloway sentenced Daniel to 7 years in federal prison with no chance of parole in the first 3. Restitution to be paid in full. Assets seized. Non-dischargeable in bankruptcy. It wouldn't return all that was lost. But it marked the end. Lauren and I walked out of the courthouse, side by side. Neither of us said a word until we reached the sidewalk. "You okay?" she asked. I looked up at the sky. A pale blue was breaking through the clouds. "I think so. Are you getting there?" That night, I sat by the fireplace with a stack of old journals. I flipped through years of notes, ideas, mistakes, dreams. I came across a quote I had written long ago. Something Samuel once said during a renovation gone wrong. "Don't worry about rebuilding perfectly. Just rebuild honestly." The next morning, I walked into the foundation and called a staff meeting. No agenda. No slideshow. Just a conversation. I told them the truth. What had happened. What we had done to fix it. Where we were headed next. They didn't clap. They didn't look shocked. They looked ready. Over the next few weeks, donations began to return. Not in massive waves, but in steady streams. Notes came too. From old friends. From anonymous donors. From survivors of betrayal who saw pieces of their story in mine. In March, I took a short sabbatical. I went up to Bar Harbor alone. Just me. A small cottage. A battered notebook. And the sound of gulls screaming into wind. I walked every day. I cooked simple meals. I wrote letters I would never send. 1 to Daniel. 1 to Abigail. 3 to Samuel. I returned with a clearer heart. Lauren met me at the station. She didn't cry. Neither did I. But when we hugged, something closed and something else opened. Not what we had before. Something new. The Foundation's annual report came out in April. It ended with a single line in bold. "Integrity is not what you say. It's what you survive and still choose to stand for." And below that, my name. This is my story. It does not end with betrayal. It begins with what came after.